20 minutes into the flight, Captain David Sanders heard a metallic sound behind him. Strange, sharp. He turned his head to the right. Auburn Calloway was standing there with a hammer. Before Sanders could process what he was seeing, the hammer came down once, twice, 3 times. His skull was fractured under the blows. There was blood everywhere. First Officer Jim Tucker took a hit so hard his skull cracked and his jaw dislocated. Flight Engineer Andy Peterson, the same thing. Hammer to the head, his temporal artery severed. Blood pouring down his face. This wasn't a hijacking. This was an execution. So let me rewind, because what happened on Federal Express Flight 705 that day, on April 7th, 1994, shouldn't have been possible. And to understand why a trusted colleague tried to murder 3 men mid-flight with a claw hammer, you need to know who Auburn Calloway was. So Calloway was 42 years old. Stanford graduate, former Navy pilot, honorably discharged in 1992 after several years of service. He trained as a pilot at the Naval Air Station in Meridian in Mississippi. Martial arts expert, practiced regularly. By all accounts, he was smart, disciplined, and capable. But his life was falling apart. He was divorced. He had 2 kids he desperately wanted to provide for, and he was about to lose everything. See, Calloway had lied multiple times. First, back in 1987, he tried to jump from Gulf Air Transport to Flying Tigers while telling his old employer he was on jury duty. And he got caught, fired from both airlines. Then he lied again on his FedEx application, claimed he'd been a pilot in command of multi-engine aircraft during his Navy days. The Navy record said otherwise. And FedEx found out. A disciplinary hearing was scheduled for April 8th. The next day, if he got fired, he loses access to his life insurance policy, a $2.5 million payout that would go to his ex-wife and kids if he died in an accident at work. So Calloway made a plan, a brutal, calculated plan. He would murder the crew with hammers, blunt force trauma, injuries that would look like they came from a crash. Then he deliberately crashed that plane. The cockpit voice recorder would be disabled. No evidence, just a tragic accident, and his family would get the money. His kids would be taken care of, and no one would ever know. Now the crew, Captain David Sanders was 49-year-old Navy vet, almost 3 decades of flying experience. First Officer Jim Tucker, 42-year-old Navy, solid pilot. Flight Engineer Andy Peterson, 39 years old. These were professionals, routine guys doing a routine job, hauling electronics from Memphis to San Jose on a calm, clear Thursday. They had no idea Calloway was even supposed to be on their flight. But here's the thing, Calloway had originally been scheduled as part of the actual crew, but the day before, he'd exceeded his flight hours by just 1 minute. So he couldn't fly. Instead, he was listed as a jump seat passenger, a common practice where FedEx employees hitch rides to the next shift. So when the crew saw him aboard, they didn't think twice. They just saw a colleague, no big deal. But there were red flags, small ones. Calloway sat in the cockpit instead of further back in the plane where passengers were supposed to sit. The crew shrugged it off. They were all FedEx. It wasn't a big deal. Then there was a guitar case. Calloway said he played guitar and wanted to practice while away from home. Reasonable? So he stored away in the galley behind the cockpit. It didn't contain a guitar. Inside, 2 claw hammers, 2 sledgehammers, a knife, and a spear gun. And then, during pre-flight checks, Flight Engineer Peterson noticed something weird. The circuit breaker for the cockpit voice recorder was pulled, disabled. He flipped it back on, assuming it was a mistake. He didn't report that. He should have. Takeoff was smooth. The skies were perfect. CAVU pilots call it clear and visibility unlimited. The kind of day you live for as a pilot. The McDonnell Douglas DC-10 climbed out of Memphis airspace without issues, then reached 18,000 feet. Everything was just fine. Until Calloway stood up and walked to the galley. He opens the guitar case. When he came back, he had the hammer. And that's when Captain David Sanders turns his head, sees him standing there, and the attack was instant, vicious. Sanders took 3 blows to the skull before he could react. Tucker's head exploded in pain, fractured skull, dislocated jaw, and Peterson's artery was cut open. There was blood spraying everywhere. All 3 men were seated, belted in, strapped down. Calloway had the element of surprise, military training, and weapons. They were unarmed, barely conscious, just bleeding out, and they were about to fight for their lives at 18,000 feet. Now, Tucker's right arm went dead. The hammer blow to his skull had done something to his nerves. He couldn't feel his hand, couldn't move his leg, but he was still conscious, barely. He lunged for the controls. Sanders and Peterson tried to get out of their seats, tried to fight back, but Calloway had already retreated to the galley. For what? More weapons? So he comes back with the spare gun, loaded, aimed right at them. "Get back in your seats," Calloway said. His voice was calm and cold. This is a real gun, and I will kill you." Peterson didn't hesitate. He grabbed the shaft of the spear before Calloway could fire. That's when the plane went insane. Tucker, half paralyzed and bleeding from his head, realized something. The only weapon they had was the aircraft itself. So he disconnected the autopilot and yanked the yoke. The DC-10 pitched up hard. The nose climbed. The plane rolled into a 135-degree bank, almost completely inverted. Calloway, Peterson, and Sanders were thrown against the ceiling of the galley like rag dolls. The cargo in the back shifted. The whole aircraft groaned under G-forces. In the back, Peterson and Sanders were wrestling Calloway for the spare gun. Blood from Peterson's severed artery was spraying everywhere. Sanders had taken 3 hammer blows to the head and was barely holding up. But they kept fighting. Tucker rolled the plane out at 13,000 feet, 5,000 feet lost in just a mere few seconds. The plane stabilized for a moment. Calloway broke free. He still had that hammer. So he swung it at Peterson, connected. Peterson's head just snaps back. Then he turned on Sanders. Another blow. Sanders' vision went black for a second. He could feel the warmth of his own blood soaking his shirt. Tucker saw what was happening, so he pulled the yoke again. The plane pitched into a steep dive. The altimeter unwound. 12,000 feet, 11,000. The engine screamed. The airframe shuddered. Tucker, with one working arm, fought to pull the nose back up. His depth perception was gone. One of his eyes wasn't working right. He couldn't feel half his body, but he leveled it out somehow. So in the galley, the fight is continuing. Sanders and Peterson were both blacking out. Peterson had no pulse at one point, just bleeding out on that floor of that plane. Sanders grabbed for the hammer, missed, took another hit to the head. Wait, check this out. Sanders realized something in that moment. Calloway was going to kill them. This wasn't a hijacking. This wasn't a ransom situation. This man had come here to murder them and crash the plane. If they didn't stop him, they were all dead. So Sanders did the only thing he could. He lunged, grabbed the hammer out of Calloway's hand, and he hits him twice in the head. Calloway just drops. For a second, it looked like it was all over. Calloway was on the ground stunned. Sanders was gasping for air, covered in blood, his own and everyone else's. Peterson was barely conscious, his arteries still pumping that blood onto the floor. Tucker still at the controls asked Sanders if he could land the plane. Sanders says yes. They switched positions. Tucker stumbled to the back to help Peterson while Sanders, half blind and concussed, took over those flight controls. He declared an emergency, requested clearance to turn around and land back at Memphis. But here's the problem. Calloway wasn't done. The moment Sanders turns his back on him, the fight started again. Tucker and Peterson were in no shape to fight. Tucker's right side was useless. Peterson was dying from blood loss. But Calloway was back on his feet swinging. The plane lurched. Sanders was trying to fly while listening to the sounds of his crew getting beaten to death behind him. So he pushed the throttle forward, flew faster than he's supposed to. Way faster. His training told him to stay below 210 knots, but he didn't care. He needed to get this plane on the ground before Calloway killed them all. The alarm started blaring. overspeed warnings, too much weight. The plane was still loaded with fuel, way over the maximum landing weight, but there was no time to dump it, no time to do anything by the book. Sanders flew as fast as the DC-10 could handle, and blood was dripping into his eyes. His right ear was hanging half off his head. Behind him, Tucker and Peterson are still fighting back there. Sanders got on the radio. His voice was steady, somehow, despite the fact that he was half dead and flying a plane that was screaming at him to slow down. Memphis FedEx 705, we have an emergency. We need to land right now. Air traffic control cleared him for runway 9, a short runway. Sanders looked at his instruments. The plane was heavy, fuel tanks full, cargo loaded. He was coming in way too fast. Negative, Sanders said. Give me runway 36, the long one. They gave it to him. Behind him, the fight's still going on. 25 minutes, that's how long Tucker and Peterson fought Auburn Calloway in the back of that plane while Sanders flew them home. 25 minutes of hand-to-hand combat at that added altitude. Blood everywhere. That galley looked like a slaughterhouse. Tucker couldn't use his right arm. His skull was fractured, his jaw was dislocated. Calloway had tried to gouge out one of his eyes during the fight, but Tucker kept swinging, kept grabbing, kept doing whatever he could to keep Calloway away from Sanders. And Peterson had lost so much blood, he had no pulse at one point. His temporal artery was severed, blood just pouring out of his head. He should have been dead, but he stayed in the fight. And Calloway wasn't stopping. He was a trained martial artist, former Navy pilot. He knew what he was doing, and he had nothing to lose. If this plane landed, he was going to prison for the rest of his life, so he fought like a man with no future. Sanders focused on the runway. He was coming in high, too high. The plane was doing over 210 knots, way faster than it should on approach, but he couldn't slow it down, not with Calloway still fighting in the back. If Sanders took too long, Calloway might win, might overpower Tucker and Peterson, might get to the cockpit. So Sanders flew it fast and rough. The Memphis skyline came into view. Sanders lines it up with runway 36L. His hands were shaking, his vision kept blurring. He was pretty sure he was concussed. Hell, he knew he was concussed. But he kept his focus on the numbers. The runway threshold, the approach lights. If you listen to that cockpit voice recorder from those final minutes, it's chaos. Warning alarms blaring, overspeed alerts, ground proximity warnings, the plane screaming at Sanders to pull up, slow down, or do something. Sanders ignored all of it. He only heard one alarm, the one that mattered. The rest was just noise to him. So he pulled back on that yoke. The nose came up. The main gear hit the runway hard, way too hard. The plane bounced, slammed down again, and the tires are screaming. The brakes locked up. The DC-10 shuddered and groaned, but it held it together. Sanders brought it to a stop. Emergency vehicles were already swarming the tarmac. Police, ambulance, fire trucks. They'd been warned that something had gone horribly wrong on Flight 705, but they didn't know what. The responders climbed into the plane using the emergency ladder in the escape slides. It took them a while to get inside. When they finally did, they stopped dead. The interior of that plane looked like a war zone. There was blood on the walls, blood on the ceiling, blood pooled on the floors, weapons scattered everywhere, hammers, the spear gun, a knife, and 3 men just barely alive, covered head to toe in their own blood. Who's the bad guy? One of the officers asked. Sanders pointed at Calloway. They handcuffed him. Then they asked Sanders to stand on the chain, literally step on the handcuff chain, to keep Calloway pinned while they got Tucker and Peterson out. Peterson had no pulse. The paramedics worked on him immediately, trying to get his heart going again. Tucker was semi-conscious, muttering something about his son. Sanders just stood there, still in his captain's uniform, still covered in blood, watching his crew get loaded into ambulances. Until they took Peterson and Tucker, Sanderson walked back from the cockpit. He found his glasses on the floor. They were only slightly damaged. He picked them up and put them in his pocket. just in case the FAA asked him to sign something. When he finally got off the plane, he was about to climb into an ambulance, but they stopped him. They needed the ambulance for someone else, for Calloway. Sanders watched them lower the man who had just tried to murder him into the ambulance that should have been his. Then he waited for the next one. The doctors worked on all four men for hours. Tucker's skull was fractured in multiple places. His jaw was dislocated. He had deep gashes on his arm where Calloway had tried to stab him with the spear. His right eye was damaged. Calloway had tried to gouge it out during that fight. Peterson's injuries were even worse. His temporal artery had been severed. He lost so much blood that his heart had stopped. The doctors had to sew him back together piece by piece. Sanders had multiple skull fractures, deep gashes across his head. His right ear had been nearly torn off. They had to sew it back into place. But they all survived. The DC-10 didn't fare much better. About $800,000 in damage. Blood was soaked into those carpets. Dents in the walls from the impacts. And that galley was just completely destroyed. But the plane was still flyable. As of 2011, it was still in the FedEx fleet. Tail number November 306 Foxtrot Echo. Still hauling cargo for FedEx. So the FBI searched Calloway's apartment. They found his will, a power of attorney form, everything nearly prepared. On May 17, 1994, Calloway was formally indicted by a federal grand jury. The charges: attempted murder, air piracy, and interference with a flight crew. So they started the trial in 1995. He tried to plead temporary insanity. It didn't work. The jury didn't buy it. Temporary insanity? Nah. This wasn't a snap decision. This was premeditated murder. Calloway had disabled the cockpit voice recorder before takeoff. He packed hammers, a spare gun, and a knife into a guitar case. He timed the attack for 20 minutes into the flight, far enough from Memphis that turning back would be difficult, but not so far that the crew would be relaxed. And the coldest part, he planned the injuries. Blunt force trauma to the head, that's what you'd expect to see in a plane crash. If Calloway had succeeded, if he had killed Sanders, Tucker, and Peterson with those hammers, and they then crashed that plane, investigators would have found 4 bodies with head injuries consistent with trauma. No evidence of foul play, just a tragic accident. The cockpit voice recorder only looped every 30 minutes. So even if it had been working, Calloway's plan was to keep the plane in the air for at least 30 minutes after the murders. By the time he crashed, the recording of the attack would have been completely erased. Clean, efficient, untraceable. His family would get the $2.5 million life insurance payout. His ex-wife could pay off all her debt. His 2 kids would be set for life, and the disciplinary hearing scheduled for April 8th, the one that would have cost him his job and his benefits, would be irrelevant. He'd be remembered as a victim, an innocent jump seat passenger who died in a terrible accident. But Jim Tucker had fixed the voice recorder during pre-flight checks. That recording, Calloway's voice saying, "This is a real gun and I will kill you," was the evidence that sealed his fate. So the jury convicted him on all counts, 2 consecutive life sentences in federal prison, no possibility of parole. Calloway's still alive and still in prison. But the 3 men he tried to kill, they paid a price too. None of them could ever fly commercially again. The injuries were too severe. Nerve damage, joint damage, eyesight problems that would never fully heal. Sanders' right ear never sat quite right after they sewed it back on. Tucker lost partial function in his arm and leg. Peterson's artery was repaired, but the blood loss had done permanent damage. And beyond those physical injuries, there was the trauma, the betrayal, and this wasn't a random hijacker. This was a colleague, someone these guys trusted. Someone who sat in the cockpit with them before, chatted with them, and then tried to bash their skulls in with a hammer. Still, Tucker found a way back to the sky years later. When the FAA introduced light sports regulation, he used them to fly recreationally. He taught his son Andy to fly in a Loscombe 8 Alpha. In '95, all 3 men were awarded the Gold Medal Award for Heroism by the Airlines Pilots Association. It's the highest award that can be given to any civilian pilot. They've done the impossible. They fought off an armed attacker at 18,000 feet, kept a 70-ton aircraft from becoming a weapon, landed a plane that had been thrown into barrel rolls and inverted flight while bleeding out from head wounds. And they survived one of the most brutal mid-air fights in aviation history. All because Jim Tucker had flipped a circuit breaker back on during free flight checks. That'll do it for today's story. Hope you enjoyed this one. And stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button so you can see more stories like this. Again, I'm in a Tesla, self-driving. So everything's safe. Keep my eye on the road too. Thank you. See you in the next one.